Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Autoimmune Summit. Today, I want to introduce Kelly B Haney. She's a certified holistic nutrition coach, podcaster, speaker, and author. And Kelly was diagnosed with a autoimmune disease called ulcerative colitis in her teens. At the age of 30, she was faced with a life-threatening disease flare-up that inspired her extraordinary journey into natural healing. Through this pivotal transformation, she has remained completely flare-free and medication-free for well over a decade. She's a living testament to the body's remarkable ability to heal when given dedicated holistic support. So, Kelly, thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of the summit.
Adrienne, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored and excited to be participating in this.
Oh, good. Well, I can't wait until you get to share a little bit of tidbits of knowledge and what you've learned throughout your whole journey. So I want to start out by asking, how did this all start out for you? Like, what symptoms did you first have? How old were you? I'll just let you take it away.
Sure. Yeah, it started for me way back at the turn of the millennium, way back in 1999. I was your typical college kid at that point, and I had always been a healthy child. I was a healthy teenager, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I started having these crazy symptoms. And with ulcerative colitis, it's a disease of the large intestine, the colon. So to add insult to injury, we're talking about pretty embarrassing symptoms on top of everything else. And that started with an increase in bowel movements, which became diarrhea, which became bloody diarrhea, which became incessant bloody diarrhea. And that's coupled, of course, with rapid weight loss, fatigue, dehydration. And I had a few weeks of this. It was not going away. So my mom took me to the ER, where I was quickly admitted to the hospital, met my first gastroenterologist, had my very first of many colonoscopies, and was diagnosed with the autoimmune disease and inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, at that point in time when I was a 19-year-old kid.
So, Kelly, do you have any idea what sparked this at such a young age?
It's interesting. One of the things I've learned since is that for a lot of people, and possibly this is true for a lot of people watching this, is autoimmune diseases tend to present around that age. And I think that one of the big life shifts that's occurring around that age, of course, is you essentially move from childhood to adulthood, or that in-between period where you've left home or you're just living a much more independent life. And for me, I think that involved, it was the 90s. I did not have a healthy diet or lifestyle, but I was eating a lot of my mom's homemade food, at least when I was young and at home. And then shifting into college, I was eating much more fast food and, just whatever, very different, even worse lifestyle looking back. So I think it was just, having a very strong genetic predisposition, which I've learned since, adding that additional layer of a not so healthy lifestyle, taking that up to the next level, is probably the straw that broke the camel's back for me.
Okay. So how long did you go through this struggle?
Yeah, so it was about 10 years. And that started out, I had that initial hospitalization with a diagnosis and was immediately put on the regular cocktail of medications, the anti-inflammatories. Antibiotics used to be a common protocol, interestingly. Not so much anymore, thank goodness. And steroids, definitely steroids were always a big deal, as they are for many autoimmune diseases. And it was interesting because when I was 19, that initial flare, going on those medications, the flare resolved pretty quickly. And, even though I had been told, okay, you have this chronic, incurable disease, initially I was like, oh, well, maybe it's not going to be such a big deal. But then that was naive because, of course, another flare popped up and then another flare popped up. And each time it would be, okay, keep taking these high-dose anti-inflammatories all the time. And then every time you have a flare, we'll put you on the steroids. And it's just, it was a cycle. It was just kept going and going throughout my 20s. I experienced a significant amount of mild to moderate flares during that period. And again, I already listed what the symptoms were. Another big symptom with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's is bowel urgency, which is that I got to go and I got to go right now experience. And that's very disruptive to a normal life. So it was a lot of life disruption and just a very limited life. And I know anyone watching will understand this who has an autoimmune disease. Even when you're doing well, you're kind of always looking over your shoulder to think like, when is that next flare gonna ruin everything? So that was about a decade. And then I can talk about what came next, which was my severe flare, the first severe flare extremely severe flare that I ever experienced.
Oh God. So that must have been really frustrating for you for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
You were like, you had all these symptoms, and like, how awful would that be? So tell us about the last big flare you had.
Yeah, it was, not every day was bad, of course, during those 10 years. There were periods of time where I was good. I was okay. Again, like relying on those medications. But I did get to a point later in my 20s. I had gotten married in my mid 20s. And then later in my 20s, I did get to a point where, because the medications had once again put me in remission, I was doing pretty well. And I used that opportunity to get pregnant. And thank God I had a healthy pregnancy. I had a healthy baby, big relief. And then it was a little over a year later that another flare began. But this one very, very quickly was like, whoa, this is nothing I have ever experienced. And this is the flare that showed me the super destructive, dangerous potential of the disease. It quickly escalated to a severe flare and then an extremely severe flare. And I will, in telling this part of the story, I will spare the more graphic details. But essentially, it was the winter of 2010, and I was in and out of the hospital 3 different times for weeks at a time during that winter, just trying to get this flare under control. And what was happening was that in the past, steroids had been pretty effective. Like anyone who's been on them knows they're very unpleasant. But generally speaking, at least for me, they had been effective in the past in getting the flare to calm down. But this time in the hospital, even on very high doses of IV steroids, there was only a minimal impact to my symptoms. So what kept happening is that the IV steroids would get me to a point where I was stable. And then, of course, they would kick me out, send me home because I was stable. They'd send me home on oral steroids and I would just crash again. And I would have to go back to the hospital, back through the ER, get admitted again. And it just kept repeating. And this happened several times that winter. And during the 3rd hospitalization, I was given a colonoscopy. And just one quick interesting note is that a few months prior to this flare starting, I had my regular colonoscopy, which I get every few years, just as part of having a disease, this kind of disease. And that colonoscopy was like beautiful looking colon, right? It's what you want to hear. And then here we are just a few months later, and there was extreme level of severity of inflammation throughout my entire colon. The doctor physically couldn't get the scope past a certain point. There was so much inflammation. And my weight had dropped down to about 80 pounds. And I started out at 110 pounds. So I was already pretty thin. I did not have any weight to lose. Yet somehow I lost another 30 pounds through this experience. So I was skin and bones, as you can imagine. It was pretty horrifying. So the next step generally at this point would be surgery to have your entire colon removed. But this is one of those blessing in disguise moments is what this was, is that because I was so underweight, malnourished, and depleted, I was actually too sick to have the surgery because, the question was, is she really going to be able to survive this big surgery? So, I got out of the surgery, but unfortunately, I still had this problem that I was wasting away. And it was really getting so bad. It's my husband, my parents, my close friends who really were aware of what was going on. Everyone was actually preparing for the fact that I may not survive this, just in general. And so it was just a really, really scary time for everyone. The next step was to start me on a powerful immunosuppressant drug via infusion. And this is one of those, next level, like big deal drugs. And it's exactly what it sounds like, right? Immunosuppressants suppress your immune system. And during those days in the hospital, knowing that this was kind of on the table, I had done a lot of research and had learned a lot about the potential side effects of these drugs, both short-term and long-term. Was very concerned about putting that in my body. The effects of purposely shutting down immune function, not great, right? So I was tremendously apprehensive, but I had no other choice at this point. I had to live, right? I had this baby at home who I had missed so much of her life because I was stuck in the hospital with this disease. So of course I said, let's do it. What other choice did I have at that point? And fortunately, the drug actually started working very quickly, which is not typical of these drugs. I think coupled with the massive amounts of steroids that I was still on, I was able to finally go home and not immediately start crashing again. But I was still very, very sick, and I had to rely on my husband and my mom and my wonderful friends to take care of me. I still wasn't able to be much of a mom to my little one, which was 100% the worst part of this whole experience, was just missing that precious time, that I will never get back. So very lonely, very desperate, very hard time. And by now it was summertime and I was getting a little bit better. I was still going into the hospital for these infusions every few weeks of the high dose of this drug, and still hating everything about that and being so scared. And I started having kind of this gut feeling that being on these drugs were just not going to be good for me. But I was getting better slowly until I wasn't. And then I hit a plateau. Oh, I wasn't getting worse. I wasn't getting any better. And I was still not in remission despite being on all the drugs at this point. And it was still a very limited life. So I talked to my doctor about this and I'm like, look, like what is going on? And he said, okay, let's switch it up. There's other immunosuppressants. Like, let's try this one that you inject into your belly. So I was like, all right, well, I guess that's better than having to go in and get a 4-hour-long infusion. So I went to the doctor's office so they could show me how to do this the first time. And I had an allergic reaction to it. And then I ended up back in the ER.
Oh, Kelly, like what a terrible experience. But I think people listening to this, they might relate to it. So yeah. I want to hear when you get to that aha moment. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah. I'm almost there. Don't worry. Yes. So, and you're right. I think people who with autoimmune disease in general, there's a lot of this like, are you kidding me moments, when you think it can't get any worse, it gets worse. But yeah, so I was very beat down at this point. I was feeling just desperate. The flare had been going on for about 7 months when this happened. And my doctor, of course, is like, okay, let's figure out the next immunosuppressant. That one's obviously off the table, but there's more. And I said, no. I said, I can't do this anymore. And he was like, what do you mean you can't do this anymore? I said, I'm not doing these immunosuppressants anymore. I'm not infusing anything. I'm not injecting anything. And he said, you're crazy, in a very polite way. He told me I was crazy. And that was it. But it actually wasn't it, because then when that drug wore off a few weeks later, my symptoms all came raging back. And this was the point where I was just broken, right? Like, anyone with an autoimmune disease who's been in this position can relate to, all you want is just to live a normal life. Like, that is just, and it's the little things, right? Like, I wanted to be able to do laundry. I wanted to make lunch for my little girl. Like, you just so badly want to live a normal life. You want your life back because it's taken from you when you're sick. Mm-hmm. So I was in a really bad place, and I just ignored everything that was happening. I just ignored it. And it went on for a couple more weeks. And then it got to the point where I was like, okay, I can't ignore this anymore. I need to live. Like, if I continue to ignore this, I'm not going to live. So I went back to the ER for the 4th hospitalization of 2010. I had to endure the "I told you so" lecture from the doctor, which was a little hard to swallow.
Oh, God.
And it had gotten so bad, I needed a couple emergency blood transfusions at this point. So I was in pretty bad shape. But this is where the story changes, because for some reason, things were different this time. And the IV steroids, which really weren't helping me all this time, suddenly just started working. I started getting better fast. I stopped fighting it, and I took another immunosuppressant. This one was an oral one, so at least it felt a little less oppressive. And all these drugs, like, everything started working, and it started working fast, okay? So I was able to come home. On my way home from the hospital after the 4th hospitalization, I had this moment of just peace, saying, like, this is it. This flare is going to end, and everything's going to be okay. And I took that to heart. And sure enough, I did continue to get better. I was able, within a month after all of this, I was able to get back into remission, finally, a year later. But I had a couple problems remaining. One was that my body was just destroyed at this point, right? It was so beat up, so damaged from all this that had happened, and especially from the medications at this point. And I was still taking this immunosuppressant every day. I would pop that pill, and just my warning sirens were going off, knowing these potential side effects. But more than that, there was just some gut feeling inside of me that said, not good, not good. But, I didn't want to seem ungrateful. And I still don't want to sound ungrateful, because these drugs really did save my life. And I think it's important to say, before I found any other way forward, these drugs did save my life. But I did not want to be on them. And yet I felt very stuck. At this point, I was only 30. I was 30 years old. The doctor kept telling me, you're going to be on these forever. And after what had happened the last time, I said no. It was just, I didn't even think I could entertain the thought of getting off of them. But here's another one of those blessing in disguise moments, because it was about a year later, I had a bunch of tests done, and it showed that, okay, yeah, these are causing some serious problems. And it turned out that all of my fears and concerns and just everything that I'd been feeling about this, that gut feeling, actually at the end was not unfounded. Like, these drugs were going to put me in a position at some point where the cure was worse than the disease. And the doctor, my doctor, the same one who said, you're going to be on these for the rest of your life and don't you dare try to come off of them again, actually agreed at that point that I need to come off of these drugs. So that's when I'm like, okay, something is happening here, and I need to embrace this moment. So my doctor's looking at me like, it's only a matter of time, right? Only a matter of time before you start flaring again. But from that day forward, total opposite for me. I was just so determined. And I just said, no, like, I'm not going to get sick again. I'm going to come off these drugs, and I'm not going to get sick again. And I was not afraid at all, because I think deep down, that voice that had kind of been telling me over the course of that last year, that had been saying like, there's got to be another way. That was the day I was kind of propelled into, there is a better way, and I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna figure this out.
So really your attitude changed, right?
Yeah.
Your belief system changed. Like once you told yourself, I'm going to get better, that happened for you. And
100%.
the fear left. That's
Yeah.
what it sounds like, right?
Yeah. And it was, I think it's having gone through the experience of everything that I had just experienced. It changes you, in a good way, where I think also as a patient, realizing that, of course, doctors they have our best interests in mind. They do the best that they can. But I think I realized at some point that we really have to take ownership over our own health. And I didn't know what that meant at that point in time, but I knew that, I guess it's that expression, if it's going to be, it's up to me. I knew that that was the point where I had to step up and be like, okay, I'm going to take control of this situation and I'm going to figure this out.
So did you figure out diet or anything like that later, or how did that come into it?
That is where it started. The day that I left the doctor's office, after we agreed that, okay, I need to slowly wean myself off of the drug, and I'd been off of the steroids by then. It was just the immunosuppressant remaining. So that's when I was like, okay, again, something inside of me said, even though all the doctors would say diet has nothing to do with it, that never made sense to me, right? And it just feels like common sense that, well, especially with a intestinal disease, I'm like, surely diet has something to do with this. So this was 2011. The internet was very different. There wasn't a whole lot of information out there, as you probably remember, but whatever there was, I found. And it started with the book that I feel like fell out of heaven onto my lap, because to this day, I'm like, how did I find this? Breaking the Vicious Cycle by Elaine Gottschall, which not only is about autoimmune disease recovery and natural recovery and healing, it's about restoring intestinal health. And that's when I learned that is truly the key to our healing is restoring our intestinal health. And from there, I found the Maker's Diet by Jordan Rubin. I found the Paleo Diet. And I started seeing what all of these philosophies essentially had in common, and that they all are working to reduce inflammation via diet, heal and restore the gut, which is essential, to replenish our nutrients and to therefore truly heal, not just on a surface level, but truly get to the underlying cause. And of course, what that meant was eliminating all processed foods, especially the highly and ultra processed foods, which I then came to understand, like, oh, those are the foods that actually make us sick, versus the foods that actually heal us, which are the foods that we are truly meant to eat. And then, of course, we're talking about the vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, herbs and spices, and high quality meat, eggs, and dairy. But when I was starting out, and again, I was a little bit of an unusual case, because my gut was in such horrific shape by then. I couldn't even tell you how many antibiotics they had put me on over the course of that year. I had to start very restrictively. And that was no grains at all, no legumes, zero refined sugar, everything cooked from scratch.
No dairy, probably.
No dairy at all. Yeah. So it was very restrictive. And I got a lot of raised eyebrows, but in my mind, I was like, look, this may sound extreme to you, but what I just went through was very extreme. So this is nothing. Okay. No biggie. So that was something that I was, from day one. I think the key for me was just, I was all in. I was approaching everything with this whatever it takes mindset, because I didn't want to go back to where I was. And to me, eating a restricted diet for a couple years, or a very restricted diet for a couple years, was like again, like I can do this. And
Yeah.
I did.
That's way easier than what you went through, right? I mean,
way easier.
Most people that figure it out, they're like, I will do anything to, heal myself, because nothing is worse than having an autoimmune disease and just feeling helpless.
Right.
But I'm guessing you learned all about the microbiome too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which again, it's so fascinating in hindsight, not hearing any of this from the doctor and instead being prescribed antibiotics, which was actually destroying and compounding the problem. So learning all about the microbiome, yes, and how to heal through foods, a lot of bone broth. That was a big part of my life for the first 2 years there, and then probiotics. And I eventually started working with a naturopath who also I feel like is my angel sent from heaven, because she then was able to help me just kind of get to the next level of, all right, you had a good start with eating, this restrictive gut healing diet. Now let's start expanding you out in terms of the foods that you're eating and giving you the right supplements and all these kind of things. But, Adrienne, that I know you agree with me 100% on this, that my whole approach to food, though, I never went back to the before times in terms of what I would eat. The focus remained and will continue always to remain on real, whole, nourishing foods, those that I listed initially here, that are going to support our health, that are keeping us aligned with nature, and that are what we're meant to be eating, rather than the highly processed, refined sugars, all of the junk food that is so horrifically pervasive in our society, and that is making so many people sick. And it's so hard to watch.
Yeah. You and I went down a very similar path. We had different diseases. And I like to say that in the past. I like to say that I healed myself, like I had it.
Yeah.
So, I never like to label myself with that disease, because we are not our disease, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I love your story. Is there anything else you want to add? So tell me this, how long did it take you to heal once you started that change in diet?
Mm-hmm. Well, the important thing to mention is when I went off the drugs was the same time I was starting this shift, and months went by and then years went by. No flare, have not had a flare it's been going on 14 years now. And I've been off medications for 13 years and counting now. So I guess in one sense, I could say, well, I was healed the day I started, because I never got sick again. But undoing the damage, of all of the medications and everything, it really took probably, I would say, a good 3 or 4 years. But that was, I have kind of high standards. So it's like really within the first couple of years, I was back to doing really, really well. I'm a very growth oriented person. So I want to just keep getting better and see, what we can learn next and apply. And that's just, it's a healing journey, which I always say. So it's like the journey never ends. And that's a beautiful thing.
Right. So probably after a year or two, you started feeling normal, right? You started feeling like your healthy self again when you were like 10 years old, for example.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And now I'm in my almost mid 40s. And I can say, after walking this path now for well over a decade, I'm healthier than I was in my 20s, without a doubt. And I feel stronger and have more energy. And it's just, it's amazing.
It's a great feeling, isn't it?
So great.
You and I are, at the same.
Yeah.
So thank you for all that information. You want to talk a little bit about your podcast and your book coming up?
Yeah, sure. So out of this whole experience, it was really over 2020, when a lot of us had the time to start reflecting over our life, that I realized, okay, going through this and learning what I've learned, and, out of so much gratitude for being able to achieve what I've achieved, I was like, okay, it's time to give back and to share this with as many people as I possibly can. So I started blogging, and then that turned into doing a podcast, which is called Heal and Stay Healed with Kelly B Haney. And one of my recent guests is you, Adrienne, which was an awesome episode talking all about
fun.
your healing.
Thank you for inviting me. That was fun.
Absolutely. You have such a great story. So I started doing the podcast, and then I wrote a book, which is called Heal and Stay Healed, a simplified guide to overcoming autoimmune disease and other chronic illness naturally. And that's just me kind of pouring everything I've learned into something that I can just try to reach people with, because it's just such an urgent message in me to try to help people understand that we really can heal. We don't have to live our lives being a prisoner to these autoimmune diseases. Like, healing not only is possible, it will happen if we really commit to aligning with nature's principles.
That's awesome. And then you're a speaker as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, I also do occasional workshops. That's something that in 2025, I'm hoping to do those more frequently, as well as personal health or nutrition coaching, or wellness coaching, really. We don't just stick to nutrition. We talk about everything. So I do individualized personal coaching as well. So whatever opportunity is out there, I'm always very interested in spreading the message by whatever means is available to me. But that's what I'm doing as of now. And all that of it is available on my website, which is kellybhaney.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. I was going to ask you like how people can get a hold of you. So besides your website, is there another way, or is there another social media?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, you can email me directly at info@kellybhaney.com, or Instagram. I'm at Kelly B Haney, and I try to be pretty active there. So you can always direct message me. But, by any method, please reach out. I would love to meet you and talk to you. And even if you're just looking for a listening ear, I would be very, very honored to be that.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Kelly. Is there any last bit of advice that you want to give everybody before we end here?
I think it's just, from my story, and I know from your story and from so many other stories that I've heard, I think we all just, the message to impart, if there's nothing else that I want to impart, it's that it all starts with believing that healing is possible. And truly, things just tend to start to fall into place once we can really believe that. And again, start aligning with nature's principles. It's incredible things can happen.
Thank you so much, Kelly. This has been such a great interview, and I know people will get a lot out of it. So anyway, thank you. And thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrienne. Thanks, everybody.